I'm Julie Lyles-Carr, and this is the Modern Motherhood Podcast from All Mom Does, where we feature guests and content just for you to encourage and inform and inspire you for the life you're leading, the kids you're raising, the romance you're nurturing, the goals you're chasing. I've got a new friend on the podcast today, and he is just an incredible guy. His name is Sheridan Voysey, and he's with the BBC. He's a husband to Maren, a best-selling author and speaker, and he's an important voice in the journey of infertility that impacts so many couples today. Whether you've gone through a season of infertility yourself, or if you have someone in your life who is walking through it, today's conversation is packed with so much vulnerability, honesty, and a powerful look at what's next when things in life don't turn out the way you expected. Sheridan, thank you so much for joining us. And, you know, we're just so international because you are from over the pond. Tell me where you're from, about your wife, your work, all that.
Yeah, I'm living over the pond. I'm actually even further far away. So originally Australian, been living in the UK for the last 8 years. And actually, as we talk now, I'm now sitting on the 10th floor in a hotel overlooking Vancouver, which sounds wonderful, but I'm actually looking down onto a petrol station.
Oh, so. Well, yes, those amazing hotel views. Put that on Travelocity or something like that to really showcase exactly how glamorous it is.
That's right.
Well, I so appreciate you taking the time to be with us, even though you're on the road. Tell us about yourself and your wife and what you do in the UK these last 8 years.
Okay, so I'm married to Maren. We've been married since 96. We have a dog called Rupert Reginald McScruffy, who is the absolute delight of our lives. He's a little cockapoo, if anybody knows the breed. So he's very friendly, very affectionate, a gorgeous little thing. We originally from Brisbane in Australia, then I went into radio, had some time over in Perth in Western Australia, the most isolated city in the world. Then moved to Sydney to start a national talkback show over there. Then 2011, we moved to the UK, of which that's a whole story of which I'm sure we'll get into a little bit as we continue the conversation. Since then, I've been primarily writing. I still do broadcasting, but I'm kind of on the other side of the desk, really, just like you and I are now, with my author's hat on, or I do some little spots on BBC Radio Network's Radio 2, which is the largest network in Europe, and speaking at conferences. So writing, speaking, broadcasting is my career. That's what I've been doing for the last 20 years. But, the last few years have had me having to really reassess how I define myself and what's the basis of my identity, because as we'll explore, so many of the things that we base our identity on are very fragile in this world. So I would say actually now I would consider myself primarily a child of God. And then the other things that we've talked about, the kind of secondary, sometimes even third place identities for me.
Absolutely. So you're just a fellow sojourner in the sandbox of wordsmithing. I love meeting people who just...
What a phrase, Julie. I'm tweeting that.
You can steal it. You can take it. It's all yours, Sheridan. But no, it's always such a delight to meet other people who their love and their passion has been communication and getting words out and describing this journey that we're on as children of God and the twists and turns and the way things turn out that may be very different than what we expected, to be able to share that and talk about those journeys, which you have been so faithful to do. I love your wife's name, Maren. So beautiful. And you guys have been married for quite a while now. What was your original vision when you got married? How did you think married life was going to turn out for you and Maren?
Yeah. Well, I can't remember that Maren and I actually sat down before we got engaged and actually said, well, this is what I really want. I really want kids, or I really want a house with a picket fence in the suburbs or whatever. All we knew, we met at Bible college. So we knew that we wanted to serve God together. That's pretty much it. We probably did talk about a family at some stage, but I can't remember the moment. And note, folks, it's great to have that conversation before you get engaged. That's a really good question to explore. But we just assumed that family life would be a part of all of that. And so got married in 96, and then it was when we were in Perth in the year 2000, we decided, well, now was the time. I remember Maren walked into the kitchen. She said, honey, I think it's time. And I said, as a typical male, time for what? And she said, time we started a family. And I said, what, right now, this moment? Fantastic, let's go. And And so, we just assumed that once you made that decision, okay, the first month, your expectation would probably be met with disappointment. That's very common. The next month, your expectation will be met with disappointment. That's very common. But, for a lot of couples, it's the third or the fourth month, perhaps, expectation meets with excitement. Well, for us, the pattern went expectation, disappointment for about 9 months. We went and got some tests done. Those tests revealed there was a problem on my side, and that without some sort of technological assistance or some sort of divine miracle, having a family was going to be very difficult. And that set us on a whole new journey, which ultimately lasted a decade. To spiral back to your question, we assumed that family was going to be a part of our story. We never knew how difficult that journey was going to be.
Right. And more couples today, as we know, this is becoming their story. And part of it perhaps is because maybe we just didn't have the reporting techniques back in the day, say 100 years ago, to know how many people were wrestling with this. But today it feels like, wow, just on every pew, in every kind of faith community, in any neighborhood, on any given corner, we are encountering people who, just like you and Maren, assumed that family would be part of their story. And by family, I mean children, because I'm of the firm belief that a husband and a wife are a family. They are already a family. And it's one of those things that I think sometimes becomes a misconception that children have to enter that equation for someone to be a legit family. But right. When you began to look at all of the testing and the time that had gone by and all of that, did something shift in the marriage? Did you and Maren all of a sudden, you've entered a different reality? You're having to look at each other slightly differently because you were looking at each other as first spouses and then potential parents. And now we're people who live in this identity lane of, oh, the couple who's struggling to conceive. How did that change the dynamics of the marriage?
It's a good question. So the journey lasted a long time for us, and during that 10 years we tried everything from special diets to special supplements, zinc, to try and increase sperm count. There was a little bit of PCOS on Maren's side, but nothing really that was going to be a major problem. The prime problem was on my side. We went into IVF. We tried that for the first time in 2006. We then went on a nearly 3-year journey of pursuing adoption in Australia. That didn't work well. We just never got the phone call. We waited for the phone call to come and collect your little boy, your little girl. It never came. By the end of that time, Maren was in a mess, so she really wanted to go and try and do IVF again. So we did as many rounds of IVF as we thought it would take. This was then by 2010, so this is in our 10th year. So we had a big, long journey. And during that time, we had periods where we would just say to ourselves, let's just pause for a moment. And maybe that pause would last for 6 months. And we kind of think, well, maybe this isn't going to happen. We're just going to be a childless couple. But then, as anybody in this situation knows, you have a pendulum swing of emotions. And there's a time where the pendulum swings the other way. And the maternal, sometimes even paternal drive kicks in. And you want to try again, to have a little us. And so when the pendulum swung, then we started looking into things again. During that time, in terms of our marriage, we made a commitment very early on. We were once sitting down with an IVF counsellor, and the counsellor was saying, now you know that doing IVF can bring a lot of stress into a relationship. And we thought she was talking about the drugs, because the drugs basically at one moment make the woman incredibly hyper-fertile, and then the next moment almost plunge her into an early menopause. Right. Which, of course, then brings all sorts of emotional fluctuations. And she said, I don't mean that. I mean the decision-making. When you're not on the same page as to whether you do yet another round. There might be times where you're at different points where one of you wants to stop the journey, another one wants to continue. And Maren said, we've already made a decision that if this journey of having a child gets in the way of our marriage, we'll bring the journey to an end, not the marriage. And Julie, at that point, the counsellor actually slumped in her chair. And she said, I'm so glad to hear you say that, because just yesterday, a couple sat in the same seats that you're sitting in. And the woman said to me, the counsellor, in front of the husband, if this doesn't work, if IVF doesn't give us a child, our marriage is over. And so I think for us, we made that decision that the marriage wouldn't be affected. It definitely was, because there were times where I was trying to work out, say, the ethics of IVF. And Merrin was saying, well, could you please hurry up? Because while you're trying to work out your ethical quandaries, the biological clock is ticking. And sometimes it was just too hard for me to work out what those ethics were. It is a big grey area. And sometimes I actually put it on hold and didn't want to look at it. And if there's anything I would do differently now, I would kind of give more focused attention to that, because sometimes I was keeping Merrin waiting. Other times she put pressure on me. She would say this, she put pressure on me when I needed to have kind of a bit of space. So it definitely brought tension into the relationship. It was one of the main times and only times that we've never been on the same page, even after we've prayed about something, which is quite rare for us. Generally, we're facing a big decision, we pray about it separately, together, we generally come to the same page. So many times we weren't on the same page. So it definitely brought pressure into the relationship, but because of that commitment, it didn't ruin it.
Right, right. And, you know, for my friends in my life who have walked a similar journey, one of the things that's been very interesting is, as you say, there are times that for them it has felt like this desire for a child and pursuing all of the things that fertility, adoption, it gets out ahead of the marriage so quickly because it can almost seem to have this obsessive component to that. How did you navigate or recognize or not the places that it was beginning to go into almost an obsessive kind of focus? And how can couples unwind that? Where, yes, it's part of the story, but it doesn't become the entire thing that's going on in your world, which is a tall order, because particularly when you're engaged in certain forms of fertility treatment, it is keeping up with the, 27 syringes per day and this specialist and that doctor and 3 times a week and ultrasound. So how can you keep it in a healthy place when you're seeking this without it tripping over into that?
Oh, such a good question, Julie. And my goodness, we could do a PhD on just that one topic, because it is so huge. It does become a driving concern for many people, and it ruins relationships because of that. In our situation, I would have been very happy to have called the journey to an end 5 years before we did. Merrin wanted to keep on going, but I'm so grateful that she was never that driven and that obsessed. She just had a natural desire to become a mum. That's all it was. And so I think the sign that it wasn't an obsessive thing was the fact that we did have those times, sometimes 1-2 years where we weren't doing anything, and it wasn't an obsession for her, but it was still a drive. I think that there's a couple of things that you can do. Number one is to prioritize your marriage. Remember, just as you said at the beginning of our conversation, you are a family unit already. Related to that, number two, if you're a Christian, then your concept of family actually is completely different, because your concept of family, according to Jesus, is actually well beyond bloodline. It's to do with the family of faith. Right. So really go deep into that. We give head knowledge to that, but to actually go deep into that and to build some soul friendships, so that this isn't the only thing that you're trying to define your life by. Number three, I would say it does come down to identity. And so often we are pursuing that at that kind of driven level, because behind it is the question, if I can't become a mother, if I can't become a father, who am I going to be? And for some of us, that is the prime identity we've always wanted for our lives, naturally so. But this is what this last book, The Making of Us, has been all about, is trying to look at a bigger sense of self that is beyond the two main bases that most of us build our identities on. Number one, it's work. Number two, it's parental status. Sometimes those are switched, and so we say, well, who are you? Well, I'm a mother of 3, and I'm a copywriter by trade. Or for a man, it might be, well, I'm an engineer and I'm a father of 4. But ultimately, those two bases are what we mainly build our life on. And so when something happens to those, number one, unemployment with work. Number two, not being able to have children. It can thrust us into a big identity crisis. And so what I guess I'm here to say is, as a child of God, you have an identity that cannot be taken away, no matter what. Success, failure, sickness, death can't take it away. And that if you can really go deep into that, base your sense of meaning, purpose, and significance really on that identity, then things like work, things like parenthood can take their rightful secondary place. Now, that's easily said than done, and for us it took a few years of being able to walk through that. If you don't do that soul work, then it can very easily, based on that one driver, become something of an obsession. So I think that's a bit of a starting point to answer your question. It's not by any means the only answer to it, but it's a starting point. We are bigger than these identities that we cherish for ourselves.
I love that distinction, that we are bigger than that. And I think so often it's easy for us to feel very defined by certain markers like that in our lives, understandably so. But you're so right. We are so much bigger than those lanes. Now, Sheridan, one of the things that I really value about you is we have a ministry in our church, and it is for those couples who are going through fertility challenge, adoption and foster challenges, those kinds of things. And the guys will join in on occasion with their wives to be part of this. But generally, it's tough for guys to walk into this topic and talk about their experience. And yet you do, and how valuable that is. So give our listeners some perspective on what it's like to be the guy in this scenario. We hear from women a lot about the heartache, about the challenges, about the physical challenges of going through different fertility treatments. What is it like for a man?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Julie. This is so important. Some research was done from Leeds Beckett University in the United Kingdom going on 18 months ago. Would you believe it was the first significant piece of PhD level research ever done on men and infertility?
Wow.
Now that says something, don't you think?
Yeah.
The whole focus has always been on the woman's experience, and understandably so, because when it comes to IVF, you've got very long needles being pressed into very sensitive places. It's a tough gig. But the fact that the man generally has been ignored throughout the whole process, and some things that came out of that research were, number one, men are routinely ignored throughout the whole of the infertility process by the medical establishment, even by people around them. So no one asks the guy, how are you feeling about this? The woman gets asked that very often. What would you like to do next? How are you doing? Where would you like to take the journey? The man doesn't. So number one, I've had even wives tell me after they've read Resurrection Year or The Making of Us or listened to a podcast like this, they've said, oh my goodness, I've never asked my husband how he's feeling about maybe not being able to become a dad. Because we tend to associate infertility as a woman's issue. It's not. It is a couple's issue. So number one, just ask him how he's feeling. Now, for some of us guys, we're not even too sure how we're feeling. We haven't even associated some words with those feelings yet, so it might take a while. But the very fact that you've even asked it is a really important thing. Number two, they found that infertility and childlessness can affect a man's career and finances. Sometimes it can bankrupt them, affects their self-esteem. It really hits their sense of masculinity, even if they're not the biological cause of the infertility, which is really interesting. Because, again, we build up in our Western cultures a sense of masculinity that is based on having a good, successful, well-paying job, and then, or just hard work, and then being able to sire a child. And so even if you're not the biological cause, if you haven't been able to sire a child, that hits at a man's masculinity. So it hits almost every area of his life, and yet he remains in the shadows, not even asked how he's feeling or doing about this. We need to break that taboo down, which is why this is not the topic that I wanted to go public with.
Right.
This was not in my career plan.
Not part of the 10-year plan of how to build a career.
This is not the brand I want, Julie.
Yeah.
But what I've found is that the more that we do talk about it, the more it opens up space for other guys to be able to share about these things. So when it comes to, say, a group in your church, and number one, so glad that your church has got a group specifically for couples exploring this. I'm surprised even that any guys are coming along, because it can be very, very confronting. But generally, they will probably only ever come with their wife. So the next step would be, well, if they're coming with their wife, which is great, it seems like there's already knowledge that there's another guy in the church that is wrestling with this too, which is an amazingly a wonderful open door. So if I was the leader of that group, particularly if I was the male leader of the group, I would then try and get them together in a room by themselves. Try and get some sort of night together where they're just able to get together and just start the male-to-male experience opened up and talked about, because it's just so rare. So what they found in the research is that men generally won't join a group, but they will reach out to some sort of online anonymous group as a starting point. Then it might, move into, say, a Facebook group where you then do have a little bit more identity with a face, with a picture of yourself and a name. And that can lead then to a face-to-face group. So your church is already 2 or 3 steps forward, and then bring those guys together so that they can talk about it as men would do tremendous things with being able to voice what it feels like for those guys.
We've definitely seen that, and I really salute the husband of the gal who has spearheaded this, and he has been very vulnerable with their journey, and he's an amazing guy, and I see guys respond just, I think, almost out of a sense of relief. Here is someone that I can talk to, because they are trying to be so supportive of their wives. They are honoring that this is a super emotional kind of a thing, and they are getting lost in the shuffle along the way. So, I want to just encourage listeners that if you and your husband have walked a journey, whether that has been primary infertility or you've had a baby and then for some reason secondary infertility has come back around the horn and you're wrestling this, to really consider getting out there with your story, because there are so many people that it really could help. Back with my guest, Sheridan Voysey, in just a moment. How do you want to be remembered? I've thought about this a lot lately, and it's a little complicated to answer. I want people to remember me for the way I loved them, or that I was always up for a heart-to-heart conversation, but if you look at how I'm really spending my days, you'd find a big focus on plain old busy. Sometimes the things that seem to take up our time or focus aren't actually the things that are most important. And that's why I'd love for you to check out my newest Bible study from Abington Women called Footnotes. It's an exploration of 4 people we find in the Bible, people just like you and me, who end up being remembered for some things in their lives that they might have thought weren't all that important or influential, but in the bigger scheme of things, were. How do you want to be remembered? Check out Footnotes wherever you buy your books, or at abingtonwomen.com/footnotes. Now, as you mentioned, you and Maren hit the 10-year mark. It had been all kinds of medical intervention. It had been testing. It had been adoptions that never came through. How did you take a look at each other after 10 years of pursuit? Like, it feels like there should be some kind of payoff. There should be some Hallmark Channel moment, right? And you look at each other and you go, time to get a dog. Like, how did you make that transition to let that go? Because there are people who it's so hard for them to ever let go of the dream.
Very difficult decision to make. And it's a question that we get asked very commonly. When do you know that you've been given a no? When do you know to bring the dream to an end? It's something that was a difficult thing to realize, that actually there is a time to let some dreams die. We're so focused in our cultures about, pursuing the dream and having a dream and, making the dream become a reality. There are actually some dreams to bring to an end, so that you can grieve. And then once you've grieved, then you can move on to the next thing that God has for you. Now, if you've been going through the fertility journey for 2 years, I would say that's not the time yet, unless you feel it is. That's probably not the time yet for you to be considering that. But for us, the things that helped us make that decision was, number one, we'd given it 10 years. That's a good time.
Long time. Yeah.
We had we had pursued everything we felt comfortable pursuing. So we had done the special diets. We'd done healing prayer numerous times. We'd done IVF. We had looked into, at first overseas and then local adoption. So we didn't personally feel comfortable with then, say, donor sperm or something like that. Other Christians are actually okay with that. They consider it just kind of a different version of adoption, really. We hadn't really considered that angle. I'm not too sure even if now, if we'd considered that angle, we would still move ahead with that personally, just simply as a personal thing. So we had tried everything that we felt comfortable trying. That was another factor, that well, there's nothing really more. If we were to continue on with this, then we would just be doing more of the same. And then we had to just say, look, we were exhausted. We were tired from the journey. And so the thing with our journey is that we had, in late 2010, we went out, decided, okay, we'll do as many rounds of IVF as this takes. I think we did about 4 rounds, and each round then, I think, had somewhere between 3 and 4 embryos as a result. So we implanted a number of embryos over time. And in Australia, you only implant 1 embryo at a time, occasionally a second. I know it's a little bit different in the US, but the ethical policies in Australia are so much so that they say, look, we want every embryo to have a chance. So you can imagine it was quite a lot of needles and everything. On our very last embryo, when we had that transferred, Maren and I had already had the conversation by that stage and said, if this doesn't work, then let's move on with our lives as a childless couple. And would you believe it, we had a phone call from the IVF clinic saying, it's looking good. All your hormone levels are exactly where we'd expect them to be for a pregnancy. And so there was jubilation amongst our family and friends that after 10 years, at the 11th hour, when we were just about to call the journey to an end, God had come through, it seemed, that we had our answer to prayer, that we were going to have a baby. And then on Christmas Eve of 2010, we had another phone call from the IVF clinic saying, we are so sorry, but you're not pregnant. The gestational sac that had been created by the IVF drugs had no little body in it. So basically the doctors had been fooled. And so that was a crushing blow. I remember Maren putting the phone down, walking into our room, curling up in a fetal position on our bed, because it was a pretty cruel way to end the journey. All of those things went into the mix for us to make that decision. What I will say is that when it comes time to think about that, and if it does come time to draw a line, it's the thing with IVF and adoption and infertility, the whole thing, it's grief without a death. You don't ever have any funeral as such. And so you kind of have to have your own. And so for us, drawing a line and actually saying, right, now we're bringing this dream to an end. We're going to let it die. We're going to move on. We're going to cross that line and not cross it back, which is a very difficult thing because a few months down the track, the pendulum swing might come again.
Yeah, come again.
But you will be locked forever in that if you let that happen. So we had to make that decision, and that allowed us to grieve properly, and then we could move on. And that grieving process cannot happen without a death. So but once you're there, as difficult as it might sound to some people now, once you're there, then you can move on with your life. And what we've seen is then that our story has become very redemptive for other people. I don't know to this day why God never came through for us and never gave us a child. What I have been able to say and see is that our story has turned out to be very redemptive for many other people, and not just for infertility, but people who have never been able to get married or did get married and they lost the partner through divorce or through death. People who haven't been able to have a second child, people who have never been able to have the dream career or had the dream career and lost the dream career. So all sorts of broken dreams. The 2 books, Resurrection Year and this last one, The Making of Us, have helped people to get through those and find a new future. So I can see something of the plan and purposes of God in that, even though part of me still says, could there not have been another way that a child still could have been part of that mix?
Right, right. And what a powerful statement that, it's, wow, grief without a death. And to really come to a place where, in a sense, you have to decide that you're going to be the one to create that death moment, in a sense, to let something go. Because something I'm seeing in our faith communities that continues to be of growing concern to me, and I think it is fed by a culture that is also saying, if you want something bad enough, if you put enough grit to it, if you put enough determination, you can make it happen. And if it doesn't happen, it means you quit, or you didn't try hard enough, or you just didn't put in the extra hours, all of those things. And I'm seeing it mess with Christians at the level of understanding that God has a story for each of us. And sometimes pieces of that story go exactly the way we would hope. And sometimes it doesn't. And sometimes it's better. And sometimes it doesn't feel better. But to really give yourself that psychological moment of saying, okay, burn the ships. This is where we live now. This is the land in which we live. And we're going to embrace this as part of our story. What incredible wisdom that, you're right. I think people, whether it's about fertility or their call or whatever the thing was that they thought was going to be willing to release it. And, sometimes we want that Cinderella moment, right? Like, well, the moment we gave it over to God, can you believe it? Then the door opened, but to be obedient enough and leaning on him enough and even if that door does not open, to stay in the lane. What a powerful thing. Because really, at the end of the day, fertility challenge is a grief process. Would you agree?
Oh, very much. And everything you've said there, Julie, so well said. This is this particular call of discipleship for the Christian couple. Mm-hmm. And everything that you've talked about there with regards to the kind of the Disney moment and the Cinderella moment, actually that's speaking as, number one, an Australian who is now living in Europe and the UK. It's actually quite a distinctly North American thing. Mm-hmm. Now, it has then gone to other countries, but you don't find that anywhere near as much in the British scene, anywhere near, or the European scene, or the Australian scene. So I guess for our North American listeners, I would say, just keep in mind that there's a cultural thing happening here as well that is pushing you to do exactly what Julie has just talked about. I've got to keep on going and if I don't get it, somehow it's me that's failed. That is very much a North American narrative. And there are other narratives, cultural narratives that are not a part of that. And certainly then the Christian narrative dismantles that entirely. We follow somebody who was wifeless, childless, mm-hmm. Who suffered the most horrendous, quote, failure. And yet that failure was the opening up of redemption for all of us. And that is our model of discipleship, is that sometimes the most powerful service and ministry that you can have to other people will come through that crucifixion that you go through, whether it be through the loss of fertility and a family with children, or marriage, or losing a dream career, or whatever it might be. That's what I've seen. When I was trying to work out what was going on for me, see, we came to the UK as a consolation prize for Merrin. She said, the idea that life would just go on now, that we've given 10 years to this and life just continues on in Sydney, where we were at the time, I've got to have something. And any other thing that she really had dreamed of kind of doing with her life was living and working overseas. And so it's just like, well, maybe this is the time for her to have the consolation prize. Mm-hmm. So she was offered a job at Oxford University. Pretty good gig to get offered.
Pretty good gig,
Pretty good gig. So we took that opportunity and we came over. But that was a discipleship moment for me, because things had been going very well for me in Sydney. I had speaking opportunities, book contracts, a national radio show. I moved to the UK, lost all of that. Publishers were turning me down because I didn't have a platform in the UK. Nobody knew who I was. Nobody's going to buy a book from anybody they haven't heard from. BBC Radio weren't returning my phone calls back then, and nobody was asking me to speak at their conference. And so no longer was I a potential father. Writing, speaking, broadcasting, those other things I'd built my identity on, were also severely challenged as well. And so my journey of discipleship personally had to then be, well, who are you beneath all of those things? Which is then kind of spiraling back to where we began. I'm a child of God, and these things are secondary. They're good, but they're secondary things, as many as of those things that God wants to give. But the surprise for our journey has then been this redemptive element that through our crucifixion, if you like, which of course is very low case C compared to the capital case C crucifixion that our whole lives have been changed by, we have been able to see what the Apostle Paul talked about when he said in 2 Corinthians, death was at work in us, apostles, but just as death was at work in us, life was at work in you. There seemed to be this amazing ministry transformation that happens, that when the crucifixions come, the hardships, the difficulties, that if we then hand those over to God, they can become channels through which his Spirit moves to then really bring powerful change to other people. And that has been the most amazing role to take on, an amazing experience to have, that through our childlessness and through that loss of identity, then it's helped a whole bunch of other people to start again, to find out who they really are. and to go deeper into God through all of that.
Right.
So it's been a profound journey.
And I think that context gives it purpose. When you can see that it can be used to help someone else, then this thing that's been sort of amorphous, that's just hung, now begins to take on shape, now begins to take on what its function is. What a powerful, powerful thing. Sheridan, I can't thank you enough. I know that our listeners are going to feel much better equipped for if this is the story in their own journey right now that they're wrestling, or if there's someone they love who's walking through this. Sheridan Voysey, you're amazing. Thank you so much for being willing to keep looking out that hotel window where you are currently housed and take time out of your day to help our listeners and to equip us to better understand the purposes of the things that we walk through, and how, even when the story turns out a little bit differently, there is still an amazing story to tell. Thank you so much for being with us.
A great conversation, Julie. Thank you.
Check out our show notes for where you can connect with Sheridan and find out more about him. And do me a favor and subscribe and share the podcast wherever you get your podcasts from, and leave a 5-star rating and review. It really does help get the word out about the podcast, and I thank you so much. Connect with me, particularly over on Instagram. I'm Julie Lyles Carr there. I am so thankful to interact with listeners each week. I just love it. So head on over there and tell me hi. Thank you to Rebecca, our content coordinator, and to Donna, our producer, the dynamic duo who make this podcast possible. Go to allmomdoes.com for an awesome resource and community for women walking through many of the same things you do with kids and spouses and work and faith. It's such a great place for you to connect and refresh. See you next week with another fantastic episode of the Modern Motherhood Podcast.